Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of the Belinda Carr Show. Today, we're going to be talking about sheep wool insulation by Havelock.
So this is a installation that you have done a video on.
I have, I think that was last year. I made a video on hemp wool versus sheep wool. I hadn't heard of sheep wool insulation. The idea of putting sheep wool in walls was really unfamiliar and weird to me.
It seems odd to do that in the United States.
Yes, especially in the United States. But I came across it on Instagram because van lifers were big advocates of this during their van conversions.
You've mentioned that a couple of times, that it's real popular with van lifers, and I don't understand. To me, with the van insulation, you need to find the best performing material because you have a small amount of space. But it seems like the van lifers are using this because it's a natural material and they're like hippie nomads.
I get what you're saying. It is contradictory in certain ways. Like you'd want to use aerogel or some really super insulating blankets in your thermally conductive metal van to keep it as warm or as cold as possible, depending on where you're going to be. But like you said, the van lifers are hippie in a certain way. Like they are concerned about the emissions and the air quality inside their vans. So they have gravitated towards these all-natural products like hemp wool and sheep wool.
I mean, I've never lived in a van. I've lived in an RV, but I guess the off-gassing would be, is it stronger in a vehicle than it is in a home or something? Or is it that a vehicle is more airtight than a home is, and so whatever materials you're using on the inside will off gas and there's nowhere for it to go?
So you lived in a fifth wheel, but that doesn't have a running engine. You had a propane tank.
Yes, I had a propane tank.
But I think with the van, you do have a lot more exhaust fumes because you have an engine running. So van lifers are concerned about those fumes permeating into their living space.
Does sheep wool stop that from happening?
The keratin in sheep wool actually is supposed to purify the air.
What is that?
So the sheep wool strand, you didn't watch my video? Shame on you.
I did watch your video, but that was like a year ago.
So the sheep wool strand is different. The strands of sheep wool have different layers. And I think one part of the sheep wool like breaks down nitrous oxides into non-toxic compounds.
So you're saying like the sheep itself, the wool that they have is layered like the earth, like there's a crust and then there's a mantle and then there's a core?
No, sheep wool...
Was that a stupid comparison?
It was extremely stupid.
What I'm trying to get at is like you're talking about the individual strand. So is the strand different from the exterior exposed part versus the part that is close to the sheep's body?
No, not like follicle versus the tip of your hair. I'm saying in the strand itself. Like the outer layer has this like fatty oils on it, and then the inner layer is something else, and then the inner layer inside that is composed of something else. Okay, so the inner layer is made up of like these keratin molecules that apparently break down formaldehyde into non-toxic components. So even though it's behind drywall, and even if you put it in your attic, the air is constantly circulating, and the sheep was supposed to purify the air and then bring it back into your livable space.
So whenever they process this, do they separate those individual layers?
No. All they do is just wash the sheep wool. So all the oils and dirt on the outside of the strands are washed away, but they don't touch the fiber itself. They don't chemically change it or physically change it in any way.
Have you seen those videos of people shaving the sheep?
Shearing?
It's really cool.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to be really gross now, but it's kind of like in Vikings or even in World Without End, when they flay a person in a single piece. So people do that with a sheep, like they try to shear the whole sheep in a single pass.
Yes, but it doesn't hurt the sheep, as opposed to flaying a person. That kind of hurts.
Not the same in that sense.
Those videos are really cool to see. Like you see just like this big ball of something, and there's a guy holding it, and all of a sudden he comes with the shears and it's like, oh, there's an animal under there. It's really cool. And I could just imagine being one of those sheep. It's like, oh yeah, today's the day. I'm going to get rid of this wig.
I don't know what they think. I don't know how advanced their brains are.
But it's a necessary process. I mean, the sheep, they need it. They'll get caught on stuff. And so there's nothing harmful to the sheep.
No, and I think New Zealand has very strict laws protecting sheep. That's why Havelock only sources their wool from New Zealand.
It's interesting that they source all their wool from New Zealand, whereas when you think of a typical building material, the closer it is to your construction site, the cheaper it's going to be.
But it's just that we don't have enough sheep in the States.
So you've been fondling one of your insulation art pieces, which is a 3x3x3 cube.
Yeah, I made these last year when I was doing that insulation series when we were at our previous house. And this is one of my most precious things that I own. I know it's weird to say this is this cheap plastic thing, but like the thought behind it and the execution just makes me so happy whenever I look at them, because I've got the aerogel, I've got the hemp wool, I've got rock wool and fiberglass. And it's meaningful. It's not like other home decor where you can just buy it at a store and doesn't really have any meaning to it. Like there's a deep meaning behind this. There's a story behind it.
Yeah, there's a video behind each one of those.
And there's a video behind each one of those. It just makes me so happy.
How many of those cubes do you have?
I've lost count. Maybe a dozen or so.
And you still have a few empty ones.
I do.
You should keep one and just put it out as air. That's 5-head thinking.
5-head? That is super smart. That's the best insulator.
Yeah. I still think you should do a video on the art museum that's in Toledo, the Glass Art Museum. That's beautiful because the only insulation for that building is trapped air.
It's just 2 layers of solid glass with trapped air in the middle and was so warm inside.
Yeah, it was a cold day too when we were there, but it is beautiful.
I contacted all the engineers and the architects who made that building because I really want to make a video on it. And no one replied.
That was Sana, right? S-A-N-A.
Yeah.
Architects.
So to learn a little bit more about Havelock sheep wool insulation, I recently spoke to their founder, who's based in Reno, Nevada. So today we have Andrew Legge, founder of Havelock Wool, all the way from Reno, Nevada. Thanks for joining us, Andrew.
Thank you very much for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, so you all sent me samples of your sheep wool insulation last year when I was making a video on hemp wool versus sheep wool. That was the first time I got in contact with you and the rest of your team.
Yeah, that's
so
right.
How long have you been in Reno? When did you start this business?
We started the business in 2013. I want to spare you the boring history lesson, but I spent a career basically trying to get out of finance and finally did so successfully, having been posted in Southeast Asia for 6 years. And the relevance there is not that I was much closer to New Zealand, but I had been sort of cultivating this love affair with all things New Zealand. And so a couple of years before we started the business in 2013, I was down there kind of nosing around, somewhat agnostic about what I might be looking to do, but I definitely had a bias towards using some of the really cool, innovative processes that you see in New Zealand and helping to develop those things offshore. And then basically what happened is, in looking around, I learned about wool. Of course, it's pervasive in the New Zealand society. But then I started to really understand the complexities and appreciate that it's, I think, easily the most dynamic fiber on the planet. And I just kind of became obsessed, isn't fair, but like wildly enthusiastic about the potential for wool, and in particular wool insulation. And I went through some very basic business school box checking exercises. I saw the size of an industry in the US, which at the time was, the print was around 16 billion for the US insulation market. We're now north of 17. And you just see these really low quality products that,
Energy intensive products too.
yeah, and they just, the race is frankly to the bottom. And, I'm not here to beat up on manufacturers of other forms of insulation because we're not trying to take over the market. But the reality is it's something that's gotten sold on volume and low cost. And, if those are your two measures, then you can bet that the integrity is probably going to be not great and get worse over time. And I think that's what we've seen in other forms of insulation. So for me, there was just this really glaring opportunity to offer a much better solution. And I'm super passionate about the natural world and this general view that nature does it better. And so why compete, particularly when a wool fiber has been evolving for thousands of years versus synthetic ones that we've been messing around with for maybe 100? It was just sort of a no-brainer. So
is sheep wool widely used in New Zealand? That's how you got the idea?
Yes, 100%.
As insulation in homes?
Yeah, I built a house and there was wool insulation in it.
Oh, wow.
And so I can tell you that the process was not as refined as what we do here. But, that's a wool fiber being a wool fiber. It doesn't really matter as long as you clean it and get the lanolin out. You don't have to worry about smell over time. It naturally does its thing with moisture because of the follicles. And then I'm sure we'll get into more detail, but, and then the amino acids are purifying the air as long as they're inside the primary air barrier. And there's nothing else that does that, full stop. So that was the baseline for us wanting to take this raw material, move it to the US, manufacture it here. And frankly, I thought we could just do that and we could tell a few people about it and it would just take off. And boy, was I wrong. I surrounded myself with an advisory board of people who knew the space, consultancy in, green building and net zero, family friend who's third generation custom builder, who told me at the time that it was going to take 10 years for us to gain any traction. And
oh my gosh,
I didn't believe him. And, we've been at it for 8 years and we're starting to get some traction. So he's pretty accurate. But there was a lot of things where, I was deferential to a lot of those folks, out of respect for not only their time in the space, but also, my interest in learning, but an appreciation for the fact that I wasn't in the space, I was coming from somewhere else. And so, what happened to us is we sat around and did a lot of listening. And then we started to realize that, there were some pretty basic questions that no one knew the answer to.
Some of those questions being,
where does the vapor barrier go? And then
the dew point in the wall.
And literally hearing of somebody say, oh, well, we put it up because it's code, but then we take it down.
Oh my gosh.
Yep. Heard that more than a few times. And so, we're sponges for information. We're interested in helping people, cut through this industry that, I wouldn't say that it tries to not tell the truth, but it certainly has a playbook and a way of doing things.
I spoke to a guy in the spray foam industry and he called it the tribal industry.
Yeah, sure. And once you have a playbook, you're really not going to deviate from it. Yeah. If somebody wants you to deviate, you'll probably deviate from the client as opposed to the way that you're used to doing things. And so it's incredibly hard to affect change. And we found a way to do that, which has been really fun and inspiring. But, before we get into all that stuff, for what was always easy for us to stay the course is a wool fiber and its integrity. And the fact that there literally is nothing else like it,
So but through your ups and downs, that's the one thing y'all came back to.
100%, never even left it, right? Because you've got this thing that, sheep were domesticated 10,000 years ago. You've got this fiber that's on their back to protect them from all of the elements, warm, cold, wet, dry. And it is so unbelievable in its natural construct, what it's capable of doing. And again, that's when you need to go look at it under a microscope and see the 5 follicles in a coarse wool fiber and see all of the things that just happen naturally because of the way that it is built and the way that it has evolved. So, we applaud these alternative options for insulation because anything is better than fiberglass and spray foam. So, and frankly speaking, wool's not going to take over the entire marketplace on its own, right? We're trying to achieve, 0.5 to 1% market share. We're here to give people the option to buy the best thing you can buy for insulation. And we fully appreciate that that's not for everybody.
Yeah.
And so we just want to help people get educated, understand what they're up against. And what we like to say to everyone is, hey, make an informed decision. We don't really care if you buy wool or not, but know what you're getting into and appreciate that a lot of this stuff is underperforming. And they may be, trying to pull the wool over your eyes.
Pun intended.
One quick example of that is like, we see other companies call themselves something wool, when there's no wool to speak of in their products, right? So, Roxol's a huge company. And again, I think they're offering a better product than fiberglass. Their embodied energy is a little bit scary, but they changed their name a couple of years ago from Roxol to Rock Wool.
Yeah.
And there's no wool.
That's
so,
true.
We have that conversation within the broader wool industry, real wool industry, about why that's happened over time. And that's a much separate discussion. But
that's a psychological play, maybe?
I mean, I think so. Why not take this wildly dynamic, amazing fiber that people identify with and pull it into your name, even though there's no real wool there? I mean, we don't really know, to be honest.
Yeah.
It seems a little strange and misleading, but, we don't really care. Like, we just know we work with wool, and we spend all day advocating for the fiber. And, we've found a way to really enjoy that process.
So before we go into a comparison of wool fiber with other different insulation products out there, let's talk about how you'll manufacture the product. You said you have developed the process so it's superior to what the other sheep wool products you've seen in New Zealand. So how did you learn about the process and how did you manipulate it to make it superior?
We banged our head into the wall for years, got a dent in our forehead, and at the other side of that, seemed to have come up with something that works. I don't know if people will be able to see the background from our discussion, but that's a house full of loose fill or blown in wool. And that's a process that was created by accident, not by us, by someone else. And what it entails is taking a wool fiber, which is naturally a straight fiber. Even though it has its crimp, it wants to run straight. And so what we do is kind of run it through the machine backwards, and it creates a ball. And what that ball does is really effectively trap air. And air is a horrible conductor. And so what you're trying to do in a wall cavity to increase the resistance value or break down the thermal conductivity is trap air. And so those balls of wool do that wildly effectively. And so they give us an R 4.3 per inch, which is the highest I've ever seen for a fibrous insulation. The only thing I know of that's higher is spray foam. And so that is probably the gold standard for what we do. Now, we can get into this, but getting that stuff from our machinery into that wall, when you have to deal with the installation industry, it's a very, very difficult task. And that's where a lot of that head banging came from. And then the other products we make are more traditional bats. And that's a process of carding wool, just, like any textile manufacturing, and then layering on itself and then needle punching it. And there's a couple different ways that you can create that bat. You can needle punch it. And when you do that, you can mess around with the mix. We are 100% wool. But then you can also employ a technology that allows for a little bit of heat in the process, and that wool
Strengthens the fibers?
wool doesn't melt.
Yeah.
It's got a high nitrogen content. It doesn't support a flame till 1100 degrees Fahrenheit. And so, you're running it through an oven at probably 250 degrees. So it's not like the Roxol process where it's hugely energy intensive. All you're doing is you're taking a recycled poly that will melt and bond the wool together. And it's a different way of doing it, and it's much faster. And that's the way it's done in a lot of places around the world.
So you're talking about just the bats. That's when you use a recycle
So
polymer.
right
Is that to stitch the wool together?
Yeah, it's to create the bond. So basically what it does is, what we do now with 100% wool is we needle punch it. And so you send a long barbed needle through the wool and it pulls it back up on itself. And that's one way of keeping it together. To be honest, it's a fairly slow process. And it's much more difficult to work with 100% wool than adding a little bit of a synthetic that will melt and therefore give you this bond. And so, we haven't really talked about it that aggressively, but we are going to add that to our stable as well. And that is, like everything we do here, we're not going to try to convince you to go one way or another. We're just going to give you more options. And that latter piece is really designed for the trade. Like we were talking about, they're very particular about their playbook. They have a way of doing things. They don't like change. And so if you bring them a process that requires them to do something differently, they don't like it.
Yeah.
Is
that what you were referring to when earlier you said installing blown-in insulation was like banging your head against the wall, like teaching people how to install it?
Yeah, because it's a different blower. It's the same process. It's only a little bit different, but it's enough for an installer to say, I don't get it. I don't want to do it. Our bats, same thing. They look like other bats, but the 100% wool bat, the installation is slightly more laborious. And so, that friction piece
doesn't friction fit. Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't go as well as an installer wants. So you have to add you have to add a step in the equation. And
I think it has to be stapled to the studs, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it depends, like the weight of a 5.5-inch bat for a 2x6. Yeah, you want to add a staple.
Yeah.
If you're doing interior walls and they're 2x4s, you really don't need one. We make it so you can get that friction piece. But by doing by adding this other product to those that we offer, to be honest, it wipes out a lot of the excuses that the installers like to use. And so that's what the product's designed for.
You kind of have to accept that, not think of it as a compromise. You have to like you as an owner have to say, okay, I'm inventing this new product as kind of like a transition product between what's available on the market right now and the true 100% wool product.
Yeah. And look, I mean, our goal is to get more wool in more houses. And if we can say to the installer community, you can go just as fast, you can install exactly the same way, then we're reducing the excuses. And so, that's the effort. And of course, we've done all of the testing. We generally use RDH for this undertaking, but we had them really put 100% wool bat and this newer one, which we're calling Havelock Pro, for professional grade high density bat. We had them put them through the paces and run all the tests to make sure that, if we had this very low percentage of recycled poly in there, would it affect what a wool fiber's performance levels are? And the answer is 100% no. There is no ill effect. It's only for this ease of install purpose.
Okay.
So we're in the process of adding that to the equation. We're excited about it, but we will not go away from what we've been doing with 100% wool either.
I was going to ask you if when you approach people in the States, the first time you came over here and like with the product, were they baffled that sheep wool could be used as insulation in walls. But then I was thinking it's just as baffling as melting down rocks and turning that into fibrous insulation, or melting down glass and turning it into fibrous insulation.
Yeah, it's weird. We've been sort of surprised because, of all the fibrous insulation out there, the one that is a natural insulator is wool. So it's something, to some degree, it depends on your audience. Like, if you're in the broader Mountain West, where there's a pretty big outdoors ski community, you talk to somebody about wool insulation, they're like, yeah, of course, that makes all the sense in the world. I don't wear cotton when I'm in the backcountry. Of course, nobody's walking around with fiberglass on. I guess styrofoam is a cheap styrofoam cooler is something that someone would understand. But again, like, then it breaks and it floats in the lake and it never goes away. So people get that too. It's a little bit audience dependent. But having said that, it's always been strange to us that wool requires as much explanation as it does, because everybody identifies with the old wool sweater. In some instances, people will say, oh, I'm allergic. I mean, wool's hypoallergenic.
That's true.
You're not allergic. You were wearing, just like me, you were wearing like an old coarse wool sweater that your mom or dad made you wear, and the fibers would stick into your skin and turn it red. So you thought you were allergic. Well, that's, now we wear merino wool next to our skin and we see a micron level of, 17 or 18 versus what we use, which is just over double that. So, okay.
So it's just the quality of the wool sweaters that was affecting people. That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah. And a lot of, wool used to be everywhere. I mean, we used to have 100 million sheep in this country.
Wow, really?
Yeah. And that goes back to, sort of 1940s, 1950s when, war preparedness was the conversation, and the need to shift to synthetics because we could make them faster and cheaper. Guess what? That whole story started a while ago, is where we started to see the shift. And, the reason why we still see wool in New Zealand is because it's a significant part of their GDP. And it's a real part of what they do as an economy.
I don't want to offend any New Zealanders watching this, but I've got family in New Zealand and Australia, and they've told me that there are two things in New Zealand: the dentists and sheep.
Yeah. And, we need to fight hard to keep it that way because, there's a big, you're probably aware of Fonterra, which is the dairy co-op in New Zealand. And they've been doing a ton of work in China as well. And, this is all about, as income levels grow, what you eat changes. And it becomes very much about dairy and milk and milk powder and how that shifts into your diet. It's just like I lived in Southeast Asia for 6 years, and it's like, you see bicycles turn into motorbikes and motorbikes turn into cars as economies evolve. The same thing happens with your diet. And so what we see a little bit happening, what we see a fair bit of happening in New Zealand now is because of that increased demand for dairy, now sheep have to fight for a space on the land. And they're fighting with dairy cows, which, frankly, have a bigger footprint than a sheep does.
Yeah.
So, these things are never easy. The world is constantly evolving. But, New Zealand farmers are frustrated. US as well. There's still sheep here in places. And you hear these stories about, oh, we're having to send our wool to landfill. Can you help us? And, the answer is, yeah, we'd love to help you. But there's this process where you need to get everything out of the wool before I can use it. And the Kiwis are the best in the world at that. And that's
cleaning the fibers before.
Yeah. Okay. It's called scouring. And
yes,
they're just really good at it. 85% of it's water intensive, and 85% of the water in New Zealand runs into the ocean. So it's very easy to grab that water, divert it, use it to clean wool, and then you've got effluent that you can use as fertilizer. And so it's just a process that works really well in New Zealand. And we get involved in conversations, Canada should have a scour. The US has two, but they're not super efficient and therefore they're expensive. And so, there's this whole process of getting things to market. And, we've been very much a part of that discussion, and we're getting closer in the US, which is kind of fun, to be honest.
Closer to increasing the population of sheep in the country and developing processes to refine the wool?
Closer to being able to do it in a way that is cost effective.
Okay.
And can be processed without causing a major problem with machinery. So, this is a wildly sustainable fiber, right? I mean, sheep in New Zealand eat the grass that's fed by rainfall. They're clearly renewable as a population and sustainable in their growth. You're literally giving them a haircut, which they need to have. And then you're taking the scraps from that haircut and you're using it to make it an insulation, but you need to get it cleaned. And in so doing, there's something called vegetable matter, which is sort of the sticks and twigs and stuff like that gets caught up in wool. And you've got family in New Zealand, you know what it looks like. It's wildly pastoral, it's beautiful, it's grass. So the vegetable matter, after scouring in New Zealand, it's typically reduced to about 0.1% or less. Here, we can recreate those pastoral places in parts of the US, but not where all the sheep are. And the other thing is there's lack of efficiency and understanding in scouring. And so what we might see here is more like 1.5%.
Wow, that's a big difference.
Exactly, right? It seems like not that much because it's 1.5%, but if you think about the delta, it's massive, right? And so, can we get it a little cleaner here? Can we work a little harder? Yes. But what it comes down to is, we get these calls probably twice a week. A lot of times it comes down to cost. And the fact of the matter is you have to pay more for wool insulation as it is. There is a beautiful thing about wool insulation costing more, which is it's about 85% of our costs. So what is the wool?
Just the wool. Oh my gosh. Wow.
It's not the labor. It's not the power. It's the fiber.
And it's all sourced from New Zealand and shipped over here. So that is 85%.
Yeah.
Wow.
And the shipping, we're bottom. This is hopefully interesting for people. We're bottom of bottom decile. So, the cost of our logistics is about 3%. And that's great in the industry. If you think about it relative to the goods that you're moving, 15% is sort of normal. And we're 3. So we're dragging that average down, which we're quite excited about. And that's because
the weight, it's so lightweight.
Yeah, no, it's because we're able to put so much in a 20-foot container.
Okay.
New Zealand has a 200-ton press. So you're like max density in a container. And so that makes moving the raw material cost next to nothing. The process that we do here with these old carding machines, you're literally running variable speed electric motors. Then they drive big drums. There is no cost. I mean, my power bill literally, it's like between $4,000 and $6,000 a month.
Oh my gosh! Wow.
For a 60,000 square foot facility. So, there's a really great sustainability story here. Of course, then there are the inherent characteristics of wool, and then this stuff can be biodegraded at the end of an extended useful life. So, the story for wool is one that obviously we're excited about. That's why we do it. But I think back to your question a while ago now is, there's been all this need to educate people at every step of this process. And you never really know who's going to be interested in what. But at the end of the day, there's something in there that always piques a tangent and, off we go. And, there is a little bit of an X factor here that has occurred to us that has really changed our ability to create awareness. And I don't want to precede any other questions, but it is something worth talking about. And it's basically, shifting the conversation away from the trade, the participants in the built environment, and getting all the way out to the consumer,
the inhabitants of the environment.
Yeah. And
so you're saying that the demand for this product is originating from the users, not so much from the installers or the builders. Like we are demanding better products.
It is now. That's exactly right. And we didn't start in that space, but that's where we spend our time now. This isn't unique to Havelock Wool any more than it is, an effort to affect positive change in an industry, and where change comes from, and where demand generation.
And I think an ideal example of what you're saying are the van lifers. So over the last 2 years or so, I feel like there's this massive interest in people converting vans from just automobiles to places that they can actually live in. Yeah. And the other ones who are the other ones praising sheep wool, and the other ones demanding it.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, look, like, of course, we talk a lot about buyer persona, right? Anybody running a business who's trying to sell a product is having that conversation. And when you look at the van lifers and the schoolie guys, they get mad if we don't include them, in the same breath. And they're very much a part of the equation. These are, they're interested, they're curious, they're young, they're educated, they want to be outside. I mean, these are all people who understand the value of clean air and high quality, non-toxic materials. And again, like, this just stuff all just points straight at a wool fiber, right? The high nitrogen content means it doesn't want to burn, as we talked about. The amino acids in wool will irreversibly bond with formaldehyde, NOx, and SO2. These are things that are very much a part of your everyday life, certainly in building with formaldehyde, NOx and SO2 in all sorts of products in the home.
And especially from exhaust fumes in cars and vans.
Exactly, NOx from your exhaust fumes, because a lot of these things are diesel.
Yeah.
So, it's just such an easy discussion. And it's basically been a really fun proving ground for us to be able to speak directly to our consumer and understand their needs and wants, knowing that luckily we had the product that easily matched up with those needs. And so, but I will say we sort of fell into it backwards, because I bought one of those things in 2016 for fun. And of course I insulated with wool, but we went 1.5 years before we actually talked to anybody about it. And then next thing you know, we had this, we're sitting around saying, we're talking about these really difficult places to insulate as we start to build more airtight. And you've got, condensation and moisture issues and, breathability. And it's like, holy cow, this all happens and gets, exacerbated in a van. Like, and we can address that with wool. And so we've been doing that successfully and proudly. We're over 30,000 vans at this point.
Wow, that's impressive.
And like, nobody calls and complains. I've redone mine a couple times. I take the floor up and the bats are right where I left them. They look exactly the same. And that's just because of the integrity of a wool fiber, that no other insulation fiber can do that. And so we've had a great, like, an unexpected amount of fun in that space.
And do you think those van lifers have encouraged homeowners to pick up the product and use it in their homes?
No question about it. And so that's what's happening now, right? We've found some real traction there. We found a real following. it's been easy because it's the outdoors folks, and outdoors folks love wool, right? So that's been kind of the easiest discussion to have. The other thing, in fairness, we should talk about this a little bit, is the cost dynamic. Insulating a van with wool. I mean, to be honest, we see this synthetic product in Thinsulate, which I think costs more than our stuff, which is mind-boggling. But we're happy being where we are, and so you've got this sort of easy discussion happening with the person who's going to occupy that space, and we basically took that and learned from it and said, we need to not talk to the middleman, who is the builder or the architect. We need to talk to the occupant. And when you have that conversation and you get people understanding the advantages of wool, I say this all day long, so I'm sorry that it's so redundant, but it's impossible to do better than a wool fiber. And once you start down that conversation, there's no turning back. Now, it costs more, right? And so that's the hang up for people. It's very easy to get somebody excited about wool, but insulation is roughly 2% of construction costs in a home. And so against an overall budget, the increase for wool is kind of a rounding error. But it's not, $500 for 3 bags of wool for your van, right? It's 30, these are arbitrary numbers, but it's $30,000 instead of $20,000, right? That $10,000 goes a long way against some other stuff. And we appreciate that, right? Because it's not just that wool's a little bit more expensive. Everything is a little bit more expensive if you want to build properly.
That's true.
Right? And
it can have a larger impact on your indoor environment than something superficial that you would just readily throw money at, that you wouldn't think twice about.
Right.
Yeah.
And so as we've gotten, this is one of my favorite things to talk about, as we've gotten more traction in the residential space, we've actually now found quite a bit of repeat users, and they've sort of flipped everything on its head by coming back to us and saying, actually, this is one of the places where we have found we get the most noticeable benefit for the least amount of incremental extra expenditure. Does that make sense?
Yeah, interesting. And
So,
could you give an example of which space they're referring to?
it's just, so builders, I keep hammering on the consumer, and that is where we spend our time. But we have got, for sure, there are builders out there that say, this is the way I want to do it. There's an installer in North Bay, San Francisco, Marin County, who, and we're really trying to promote this, he will not work with fiberglass or spray foam. And so he is out there championing, alternative products. And so he's doing stuff with Gutex, which is, like a wood fiber board. He has been doing some installs with our stuff. He's been using cellulose, which he doesn't really like. And he's trying to replace that with our stuff, but he has to get it through his clients, right? And we definitely cost a lot more than cellulose. So there's this whole education process that goes into it. But when you get somebody who uses your stuff, like we had a builder a number of years ago down in Orange County, Newport Beach, use our stuff, and he just could not believe the difference from the day that it wasn't there to the day that it was. From a temperature control and sound attenuation and general good feel. He was literally like out there screaming to anybody who would listen, saying, there's no better way to insulate than with wool.
I have a question for you.
Yeah, sure.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but so I've recently started looking into spray foam insulation, and I have a lot of appreciation for it, because from the people I've for my research and the people I've talked to, and I even toured a spray foam factory here in Dallas, it seems like a low energy product that provides significant advantages over traditional insulation, like air sealing properties. And
Sure.
if installed properly, it can last you a really long time, and it doesn't slump and it doesn't degrade. That's the good quality stuff.
Right.
I've seen some horrible photos of like clumped up insulation that just crumbles after 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about that stuff. I'm talking about the good quality spray foam insulation. But from your perspective, from the eco-friendly insulation industry, you see the disadvantages of spray foam, right? But do you also, what I'm trying to say is that spray foam does have its advantages. Do you agree with that?
I don't know. So first of all, I'm not an expert on spray foam. I know a fair bit about it, and I'll reveal that in a second. But I'm not here to say that I've studied closed cell or open cell foam. I've seen the same pictures you have. I've heard guys like Matt Reisinger in Texas talk about the horrible experiences that he's had with it. I think he's evolved from that and still uses it. I think from an air sealing perspective, I understand the argument. And I think that we obviously are excited about air sealing homes because it makes them more efficient, meaning it reduces your heating and cooling bill. There's no way I would ever get comfortable thinking that spray foam wasn't going to off-gas its whole life. I've never seen that proven. I hear people say, oh yeah, it's done after 48 hours. Well, I mean, I personally don't believe that. The way that things change, the way that houses settle, you see these things where you get, a small crack. Well, now you've got a place for vapor drive to occur. It gets behind the spray foam. And so for me, I just wouldn't want those drums of chemicals from the back of the truck going into my house that becomes the space that I occupy and I'm going to breathe. So that's my personal view on spray foam. Now, are there other ways to air seal? Are there other ways to think about continuous insulation, like on the exterior, that are products that I don't make?
Yeah.
So, I'm not trying to champion us. Yeah, there are. And, are there ways to use membranes to create air tightness?
Yeah.
That will create less of an issue for off-gassing potential? Yes. The building science conversation continues to evolve.
Yes.
And so I think the challenge where I would just never get comfortable with spray foam in my space. I mean, think about the advertising you see for it. It's a guy or a girl in a moon suit, right? With all sorts of stuff all over them. And then talk about some of the early guys. Forget what they called. They called like
hazmat suits.
No, yeah, but they would get something called like halo circle or something. They'd go blind for like 3 days from spraying this stuff and not protecting themselves properly. I'm sure that we've evolved away from that too.
Yeah.
But I just, the thought of mixing chemicals at the end of a gun in a uncontrolled environment, meaning you're going to have temperature change throughout the day, like there's just no way that's ever happened.
I agree with that. There are lots of variables on a job site but also I think spray foam is continuing to evolve too. But I completely get what you're saying. There are lots. It's just a different mindset.
And also and like foam board on the exterior, right? You might be able to solve the same thing. So look, we're not in the business of trying to beat up on other people trying to do cool things in the built environment. That's not our job. I just what I am up against a lot is the sort of the synthetic discussion versus the natural one. And I'm in a position where I naturally gravitate towards something more natural versus synthetic. Fair enough?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Yeah, I get what you're saying. I have one question. So all your wool was sourced from New Zealand. During the pandemic over the last 2 years when New Zealand was basically shut down for prolonged periods of time. Did y'all have any issues getting the material out of the country, or it was still the cycle was still going on there in the country?
No, we didn't have any issue. We're lucky for a couple of reasons. One is we saw the potential for a problem, and two, we're capitalized in a way that we were able to manage our way through it. So we massively increased our raw material sourcing. And then where, we did run into a problem is at the port in the US. But we were far enough ahead of it that we never had an issue with raw material.
That's good.
But I don't feel like we're out of the woods because, it's public knowledge that these port challenges are still there. And, sadly, there's not a lot of people in the logistics space, stepping into the fray to try and find a solution. And the reality is, if we have any more uncertainty in that space, then it would be very difficult for us to keep sourcing our wool from offshore.
That's a little frightening. I hope it doesn't get to that point.
Me too. And to be honest, I mean, we have very similar and arguably worse problems in U.S. trucking. So, logistics is a real challenge for sure.
So y'all manufacture just in Nevada and then y'all ship all across the states?
We do. We long for a facility on the East Coast, either owned or partner, and I'll just say we're working on it.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
What else are you working on for the rest of the year?
Well, there's always this challenge because of how dynamic a wool fiber is and how unique it is with its air quality advantages and its sustainability. There's always an opportunity to be thinking about something else. And we've tried really hard to stay focused on the goal, which is insulating your house, because there are just so many advantages to using wool. But our business has grown up. We're still small, but we're real now. And it definitely took us a long time to get to that stage. And so there's an opportunity to reach out and look at partnerships in doing other things
with the material, like creating other products for your home.
Using wool, but in sort of different but similar spaces.
Okay.
And I would just say, I don't want to be really clandestine here, but it is stuff that we're working on.
Yeah.
So rather than identify it, I would just say that there's some really amazing air quality advantages to wool, and there's some pretty easy ways to get it in really important places within a home, and we're working on those.
Very exciting. Yeah. Thanks a lot for coming on the podcast, sharing your backstory and all the challenges you faced and how you've managed to overcome it. I really appreciate it, Andrew.
No, honestly, thank you. And again, thanks for doing what you're doing. And I hope that, the 325 million people in the US are all listening, because everybody needs to learn about everything you're teaching, about, the products in the built environment, good and bad. And I really look forward to the day that we put the right attention on how we build and the materials that we use. And, we're in it making that noise every day, and we're not going to stop. And, so huge thanks for having us and for doing what you're doing to try to help people learn a lot more.
Thank you so much, Andrew. If people want to contact your business for sourcing any products, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Well, hopefully it's pretty easy on the website. We work hard at that. And there's some touch points that go to, as opposed to one individual, that come into certain groups, and we do that so you're sure to hear from us. And so those are, our website is havelockwool.com, but then there's some, ways to learn about some knowledge centers that we've built, which you'll find your way into. We try to make a really kind of consumer, I want to learn friendly experience, and then you'll be very quickly diverted to either our phone number or certain email addresses where you'll ideally get the information and the response that you're looking for.
Great. I'll link all that in the description. Thanks, Andrew.
Cool. No problem. Thank you again. Really enjoyed this, and enjoy the rest of your day.
You too.
Thanks.
Andrew said he loves everything New Zealand. Do you think he's a Lord of the Rings fan?
Did I ask him about that in the interview? I didn't, right? How could I have not asked him that?
I assume he's been to New Zealand a few times. He has to have gone on the Lord of the Rings tour.
How could you not? That's on our bucket list.
Indeed.
We should be talking about sheep wool instead of Lord of the Rings.
So sheep wool seems like a finite resource because there's a countable number of sheep on the planet. It just doesn't seem like it's something near as abundant as a rock wool, which is basalt, or fiberglass, which is glass. But at the same time, how do you quantify that? Or let me rephrase that and say like hemp wool. You can plant hemp and it grows in 5 weeks. And with sheep wool, you can't really grow a sheep that quick.
Yeah, I don't think they're trying to completely dominate the market. It's kind of like when we spoke to Greg Wilson from Hempwood. He said if he can affect maybe less than 10% of the market, 1 to 10% of the market, that'd be good enough. He's made enough of a dent in the market.
Yeah, if there's all these companies affecting 1%, then that adds up and takes a lot away from these more energy intensive, less sustainable.
Yeah. And I really like rock wool and appreciate that they send us some samples. We've been using it in our home renovation. I think it's a great product, but it is extremely energy intensive. I mean, hemp wool, I like what hemp wool is doing in that way because they have a very similar product. It's dimensionally stable, it's tough, and it's a good replacement for rock wool. It's the same size too. Sheep wool is available in both bats and blown-in, but they send me some samples of their bats when I asked them for it last year, and it seemed a little flimsier. It's not as stable as hemp wool.
So the thermal drift, which is the measurement of how much the insulation sags over time, is going to be higher?
If you use the bats, I think so. If you have to staple them to the studs to make sure they stay in place, that's why their blown-in product performs really well, because that is dimensionally stable. It doesn't sag at all.
I think Andrew mentioned a specific R value for sheep wool, and he said it was just below something like spray foam, which spray foam is...
It's around 5, I think.
And that's probably the highest you can get per inch, one of the highest you can get, without going to some exotic materials like aerogel or something.
Yeah, probably. I think it's around 5 or so, 5 to 6 per inch. It's
similar
great.
to rock wool or a fiberglass.
I think fiberglass is around 3 to 4.
I was surprised that it performs so well.
Why were you surprised it performed so well?
Because you think of these natural materials, these alternatives to just be more expensive for a lesser product. Lots of times people move to these materials because they want the more natural thing, but it's not as good as a synthetic material. But if this performs just as well, then what is holding back the industry? And that's mostly just because the rock wool and I keep saying rock wool, but the mineral wool and the fiberglass companies have been around longer, and they've ramped up their production.
And people are familiar with it. People don't like change. So, and the idea of using sheep is there's a psychological barrier over there to overcome. But what was very interesting to me was he mentioned a new product they're developing that has some synthetic materials in it.
A binder
In it. And that's awesome. I mean, it is great to have all natural materials, but we don't have to completely shy away from a hybrid, especially when we're trying to get something like off its feet.
And it could be a binder similar to like what Greg Wilson uses for his hemp wood, a soy-based binder that is all natural.
Yeah.
Not saying it's the same product, but I'm saying like something
idea.
like that. Yeah, a more natural product as opposed to using something that will off-gas and kind of...
But it's not bad in either way, because we talked about this when, I think during our very first podcast, we talked about pulverizing hemp and putting it in a wall. And what's the purpose of it? it's still a substitute for a different aggregate. It's something like it's a hybrid of a good and a bad. So it's a step in the right direction. So I thought it was very interesting how he brought up the low energy consumption of his factory in Nevada.
Yeah, he said that 85% of the cost is just to have it shipped from New Zealand, which is insane. Imagine if they could source it locally, then the price could actually be competitive with a mineral wool or a fiberglass.
But I think another thing to consider is this product is washed in New Zealand and purified there, right? And they get the purified version of it over here.
What do they do in Andrew's factory, at the Havelock factory? Because it's already ready to go.
It's ready to go as strands, but it has to be separated and knitted together to form the bats.
I see. So that process of the needle
Stitching.
yeah,
The stitching together is what they do at their factory here in the States.
which is not energy intensive at all.
It is water intensive. I think he talked about this in the podcast. The washing has to be completely purified because the sheep are out in the open, and there's a lot of oils that they secrete that's stuck onto the wool. There's dirt and maybe small animals, like small insects or something that's embedded in the wool. All that has to be washed away before it can be processed into a product.
Is that a consideration whenever you're calculating the energy consumption of something like sheep wool? That initial process, or like from Havelock's point and on, it requires very little to no energy because they're just taking it and stitching it. But before that process, is that as energy intensive as something like a mineral wool or a fiberglass?
I highly doubt it. Having to melt rocks or melt glass and then spin it into fibers, I think that's more energy intensive. But we should definitely consider that in the entire life cycle of the product.
And not just for sheep wool, something like mineral wool as well. Like at what point does rock wool take the material and turn it into their bats or their insulation? What is that process beforehand, and how much energy does that consume? Yeah. So Andrew mentioned sheep wool as being the most natural insulating material, and we talked about the very low energy consumption because it just comes off the sheep and filtered just a little bit, and then it's put into your wall, basically. Are there any other materials out there like that?
I know we talked about goose feather insulation, similar to that, which companies like Canada Goose, they make these super insulating jackets that have a goose infill. And we tried some of those on when we went to Canada last year.
Yeah, they actually have a room you can go into that like simulates minus 40 degree temperature.
But then I looked into goose feather sourcing, and it's just horrible. They pluck the feathers, and it's because it's down feathers, so they pluck it from like the sensitive parts of the duck while they're still alive. It was horrible to watch that video.
That's different than sheep wool because the shearing of the sheep is
painless.
Yeah, painless process. I'm surprised someone like Canada Goose doesn't catch a lot of flack for that.
I don't know how they don't. If they pluck it in a harmless way, they sedate the.
When you say wool, is it always referring to a sheep? Like when you have a wool sweater, is that
merino wool sweater? But they have, what's that other one? Llamas?
Alpacas?
Alpacas. Don't they make wool out of that too?
I don't know. I guess they have the same.
So wool is like just a generic term for fibrous material. That's why mineral wool can use that term.
I'm starting to think about like all the animals you could start shaving.
Yeah. So during the call with Andrew, I was thinking about the term cheese. So there was a lawsuit a couple of years ago by the dairy farmers against all these non-dairy cheese versions that are coming out.
Like cashew cheese?
Like cashew cheese, yes, exactly. So they said you can't use the word cheese. They wanted them to call it cheese with a Z or cheese-like product or something like that. I don't know if they won that battle because at the stores now I still see it called cashew cheese with an S.
So I guess wool could be considered something similar. But I'm just thinking of like shaving a buffalo or something. I wonder if that would work pretty well. Is it that the wool is curled up and that traps air better? Because if you think like a bear or something, their hair it's more stringy.
I think they just tamed, domesticated, so you can shear them compared to wild animals.
So we should probably wrap this podcast up before I start thinking of other animals we can start shaving for their insulation.
Yeah, before Peter comes after us. So I think sheep wool is an amazing product, and I do wish it's more widely adopted, kind of like hemp wool, more than just 1% of the market. But it's just a matter of time till it scales up, though.
And it's going to take some companies like Havelock that are innovating with it and seeing what else they can do with the material other than just loose fill.
Is it though? I mean, or should they just focus on loose fill and try to grow that and convince people to switch?
Instead of spending their money on R&D, spend it on advertising to get it out there.
Or an education.
And partnering with builders and stuff.
Yeah. Would that be the best use? Because I know we can have wool curtains or wool flooring, wool carpet. That's great. But it's hard to compete with the plastic industry in that sense. I mean, everything is polypropylene now. So with the wool industry, the main competitors are glass and rocks, not plastic. So maybe we should just compete with them. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the right answer is, but Havelock is trying all different ways to make this product more popular. So hope you enjoyed this podcast and join us next week for another episode on building science, products, and technology.